Every car ever built comes with a window sticker. Make, model, price, and the name of the company that built it. So picture this. It's May of 1987. You're standing in a Buick dealership, reading the sticker on a black coupe that looks like it eats other Buicks for breakfast. And on the line where the manufacturer's name should say Buick, it says something else. It says ASC McLaren. McLaren on a Buick. From the brand that built your grandfather's living room on wheels. This is the story of the most terrifying piece of paperwork in American automotive history, and why it wasn't a mistake. Let me paint you a picture of 1987. Buick's average customer was old enough to remember the Great Depression, personally. The brand sold comfort, chrome, and seats softer than a diplomatic apology. If Chevrolet was your first car and Cadillac was your last car, Buick was the car you drove while quietly updating your will. Nobody, and I mean nobody, walked into a Buick showroom looking for violence. And yet, hiding in that showroom was the Grand National, all black, no chrome. A turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 making 245 horsepower in a decade when most engines produced numbers you could count on your fingers. The press called it Darth Vader's car, because apparently the fastest thing GM sold with a back seat came from the same people who invented the padded vinyl roof. Buick had accidentally become cool, and honestly, nobody was more confused about it than Buick. So naturally, GM decided to kill it. Of course they did. The rear-wheel drive platform under the Grand National was scheduled for execution at the end of 1987 to be replaced by a front-wheel drive Regal, a car with all the menace of a decaf latte. The fastest Buick in history was going to die so that a slower, softer, beige-adjacent Buick could live. Corporate logic at its absolute finest. But before the guillotine dropped, a few engineers inside Buick decided the Grand National deserved a proper funeral. Not flowers, not speeches. A monster. A final, limited edition so vicious it would haunt General Motors forever. They would call it the GNX, Grand National Experimental. 547 cars. 547. Remember that number, because every single one of them was about to embarrass some very expensive machinery. Here's the twist though. Buick couldn't build it themselves. The assembly line was busy, the budget was thin, and the clock was ticking. So they outsourced the most important Buick of the 20th century to two outside companies. And when I tell you who they were, you're going to think I'm making it up. One was a company that got famous cutting holes in roofs. The other was a McLaren the entire world had forgotten existed. Let's start with the McLaren. In 1969, Bruce McLaren, yes, that Bruce McLaren, the racing legend himself, opened an engine shop in Livonia, Michigan. Not England, Michigan. He needed an American base to develop engines for his Can-Am and Indy programs, and Livonia sat conveniently close to Detroit's entire industrial bloodstream. McLaren Engines was born in the most glamorous location imaginable, an industrial park off the interstate. Then, in 1970, Bruce McLaren lost his life testing one of his own cars at Goodwood. The racing empire he founded regrouped in England and marched on toward Formula One immortality. But the little shop in Michigan, it stayed. It became an independent American engineering company. Same name, same founder, completely separate path. Through the 70s, they ran turbocharged Indy engines on their dynos at 1,000 horsepower, doing brilliant work for clients who never once put their name on a poster. So while one McLaren was becoming the most famous racing team on Earth, the other McLaren was becoming the best engineering company nobody had ever heard of. Hold that thought, because the other half of this partnership started with a hole saw. 1963. A 21-year-old German exchange student named Heinz Prechter arrives in San Francisco with a suitcase and an idea. Back home in Germany, sunroofs were everywhere. In America, they basically didn't exist. So Prechter spent $764 on tools, built a workbench out of an old door, rescued a sewing machine from a junkyard, and started cutting holes in perfectly good automobiles. On purpose, for money. And it worked. By 1965, he was operating out of a rented garage behind George Barris, yes, the Batmobile guy. Installing sunroofs for Frank Sinatra, Steve McQueen, James Garner, and at one point, the actual President of the United States. By 1967, Detroit came calling, Prechter moved to Michigan, and the American Sunroof Company became the industry's worst-kept secret. Every automaker wanted him. The man had turned a hole saw into an empire. And here's the part people forget. ASC didn't stay in the roof business. When Detroit stopped building convertibles in the 70s, Prechter single-handedly brought them back. The Corvette convertible you know from 1986 onward, built by ASC Camaro convertibles, Firebird convertibles, Saab, Porsche, you name it. If an American car lost its roof in the 80s, there's a very good chance a former exchange student with a sewing machine was responsible. In the early 1980s, ASC and McLaren engines joined forces. ASC brought the manufacturing, the styling, the assembly muscle. McLaren brought powertrain and chassis engineering, sharpened by 2 decades of racing. Their first products together were dressed-up Mustangs and Caprice, handsome cars, sure, but with 0 engine modifications. Which meant America now had a McLaren badge attached to completely stock horsepower. Somewhere in England, an entire Formula One team felt a disturbance and didn't know why. Meanwhile, back at Buick, Chief Engineer Dave Sharp had an idea that qualified as corporate treason. If the Grand National had to die, it should go out faster than a Corvette, GM's own crown jewel. His advanced concepts manager, Mike Doble, took that idea and walked it straight into McLaren's shop in Livonia. The pitch was simple: 1 year, 1 chance, 1 final Buick. The phrase they used internally says everything: the Grand National, to end all Grand Nationals. Think about the audacity here. Buick, the cardigan of car brains, was hiring a company founded by Bruce McLaren and a company founded on sunroofs to build a machine specifically designed to humiliate the Corvette. From inside General Motors. With General Motors' money, it's the corporate equivalent of hiring assassins with the family credit card. And what those assassins built was a masterpiece. Here's how it worked. Finished, Grand Nationals rolled off GM's assembly line in Pontiac, Michigan, and were trucked straight to ASCC's limited edition vehicles facility in Livonia. The first batch of 12 arrived on April 24, 1987. Car number 001 was delivered back to Buick 2 weeks later. And in that building, ordinary Grand Nationals went in one door, and something else entirely came out the other. The heart of the transformation was the turbocharger. McLaren fitted a special Garrett T3 unit with a ceramic impeller, the first of its kind. Why ceramic? Weight. A ceramic wheel is dramatically lighter than steel, which means it spins up almost instantly. Turbo lag. That awkward pause where you floor it and the car takes a moment to consider your request, practically vanished. It's the difference between asking your teenager to take out the trash and asking a Navy SEAL. And they didn't stop there. A bigger, more efficient intercooler. A ceramic-coated pipe feeding it cooler, denser air. A reprogrammed engine computer with a chip exclusive to the GNX. A free-flowing dual exhaust replacing the factory single muffler. And more boost than any Grand National had ever run. Every airflow restriction Buick's accountants had ever installed, McLaren politely removed. This wasn't tuning, this was liberation. Then they turned to the rear suspension, because all that violence needed somewhere to go. A longitudinal torque arm, essentially a ladder bar, connected the rear differential straight to the transmission crossmember, killing wheel hop dead. A panhard rod kept the axle planted sideways. Even the differential cover was replaced with a reinforced aluminum piece with GNX embossed right into the metal, because if you're going to over-engineer something, sign your work. Now, let's do the numbers. Buick officially rated the GNX at 276 horsepower. 276. Write that down, because it's one of the funniest lies in automotive history. See, General Motors had a long-standing unwritten rule: nothing embarrasses the Corvette. The Corvette was the flagship, the halo, the untouchable. So, the paperwork said 276, everyone at Buick nodded with a straight face, and the lawyers slept soundly. Then Road and Track put one on a dyno in June of 1987. The reported result? Right around 300 horsepower and over 400 pound-feet of torque. 400, from a 3.8-liter V6. That's not a rating discrepancy, that's a cover-up with lug nuts. Let that sink in. Buick underrated their own car so aggressively that independent testing basically caught the company lying in the humble direction. And the track numbers? Car and driver strapped their gear to a GNX and recorded 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds. 4.7. In 1987, the quarter mile fell in 13.5 seconds at over 100 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, most performance cars of that era needed a calendar to reach 60. The GNX needed one deep breath. Now let's line up the victims. The 1987 Corvette, 240 horsepower, $28,000, was more than a full second slower to 60. The Ferrari Testarossa, $134,000 of Italian theater, slower to 60 than the Buick at more than 4 times the price. The Ferrari 328? Also slower. Gentlemen, the family coupe from the retirement brand just ran down your poster cars. The only thing that could genuinely hang with it was the Porsche 911 Turbo, and depending on which magazine you read, the Porsche was about 1/10 of a second quicker. 1/10 against a Buick costing less than half as much. This made the GNX one of the fastest cars America could buy in 1987 at any price, and the quickest regular production car Detroit had ever put in a showroom. Oh, and my favorite detail, ASSC built 2 GNX police car prototypes. Police departments took one look at the $30,000 price tag and said, no thank you. Imagine surviving that traffic stop. You wouldn't. Speaking of price, the GNX package cost $10,995 on top of a Grand National, bringing the window sticker to just under 30 grand. Nearly double the standard car. For that money, you also got flared fenders, functional vents pulling heat off the engine, 16-inch black mesh wheels, real analog Stewart Warner gauges replacing the digital dash, and a numbered plaque on the dashboard, 1 through 547. It was also the only GM product that year slapped with a gas guzzler tax. $650, the government's way of saying congratulations. Did the price scare anyone? Please. Dealers marked these cars up by as much as $20,000 over sticker, and people paid it. The last one ever built sold in Pittsburgh for close to 40 grand. All 547 vanished instantly, most of them straight into climate-controlled garages wrapped in plastic like museum pieces. Which, as it turns out, was the smartest financial decision half those buyers ever made. Still with me? Good, because this is where the Buick outlives everybody. In December of 1987, the last rear-wheel drive Regal rolled off the line and the guillotine finally dropped. And here's the brutal part, demand was exploding. Buick moved over 20,000 Grand Nationals that final year, with roughly 10,000 ordered in the last 6 months alone. Customers were sprinting toward the product, and GM shut the factory anyway. Killing a legend is one thing. Killing a legend while people are lined up around the block to buy it, that takes a special kind of corporate talent. The 1988 Regal arrived with front-wheel drive and all the excitement of a tax seminar. But the Turbo V6? That heart refused to stop beating. 2 years later, in 1989, it showed up under the hood of the 20th anniversary Pontiac Turbo Trans Am, a story of redemption we covered in our last episode, and honestly, one of the great plot twists in GM history. Buick built the monster. Pontiac inherited it. The Corvette, presumably, filed a complaint with Human Resources. Now let's talk about what a GNX is worth today, because this is where the story gets genuinely absurd. In 2022, a 568-mile example crossed the block at Barrett-Jackson for $308,000. That's roughly 10 times the original sticker. Even a driven car, 54,000 miles on the clock, brought nearly $150,000 at auction in 2025. Haggerty's valuation data puts a good one comfortably north of 6 figures. The Grandpa brand built one of the greatest collector car investments of the modern era. And then Kendrick Lamar happened. In late 2024, he named an album after this car. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 with the biggest streaming week for any R&B or hip-hop album that year. A few months later, he opened the Super Bowl halftime show, standing on top of a GNX in front of over 100 million people. Search traffic for the car jumped nearly 80% overnight. Lamar was born in 1987. He came home from the hospital in his father's '87 Buick Regal. You cannot script this stuff. 37 years after ASC and McLaren finished their work, the GNX went from a secret handshake among gearheads to a global icon, without changing a single thing about itself. The regular Grand National rides the same wave. Clean examples now trade around $65,000, and the very last one built sold for over $500,000. Turns out the best investment strategy of 1987 wasn't the stock market. It was walking into a Buick dealership and asking for the scary one. And the two companies behind it? McLaren Engines kept engineering quietly in Michigan for decades, still separate from the Formula One empire, still brilliant, still anonymous. ASC kept building convertibles for nearly every automaker on the planet. Neither of them ever became a household name. But for 1 year, in one building in Livonia, a sunroof company and a forgotten race shop built the fastest thing General Motors couldn't admit it owned. So what if the GNX, really? It's proof that greatness doesn't care about your business card. The most feared American car of the 80s wasn't built by a racing division or a skunk works with a heroic name. It was built by an exchange student who started with a hole saw, and by the American ghost of Bruce McLaren's dream. There's a sentence that belongs on a garage wall, built by a sunroof company, feared by Ferrari. And every word of it is true. And that window sticker from the beginning? Collectors now consider it part of the treasure. ASC McLaren, printed right there in the manufacturer's line, the paperwork that told the whole story, if anyone had bothered to read it. In 1988, one McLaren won 15 of 16 Formula One races and became a legend forever. But the other McLaren didn't need a championship. It already had 547 black Buicks out there in the world, and not one of them has ever apologized. If this story blew your mind, the 80s have plenty more where that came from. Our 80s American Performance Legends series covers the Fox Body, the Iraq Z, and the Turbo Trans Am that inherited this very engine. Subscribe so you don't miss what Detroit builds next when it thinks nobody's watching, and tell me in the comments, what's the greatest car ever built by a company nobody expected? This is Car Chronicles. Always read the fine print.